So let's talk a little bit more about science, since we're finishing up this idea of using the scientific method to understand herbalism. I'm a big proponent of the scientific method. I definitely think that data is important. I think observation is important. I think systematic observation is important. I think certainly people's biases can help hide the truth or can make them see things that aren't there. I think this works both ways. It works against and for you. And so if you are a scientist and you're examining something and you don't really think it's a thing, that bias will work against you seeing that it might be a thing. And if you think that the scientific method is against you, then you may have those results too. So bias is huge. The narrative that we subscribe to is something we're often not even aware of. And so, for example, you may subscribe to a narrative about how the world works, and you may not be even aware of how deeply that narrative affects you, and or that's even the assumptions that you've made. So science context really critically important in order to examine the data that either supports or doesn't support. So for this week, there's several readings. You read Hoffman, this marvelous chapter on holism, on science, on herbs, just fantastic understanding this man has. Love this stuff. And I highly recommend Hoffman as an author that I think is very trustworthy. And so throughout that chapter, I think you got a really good sense of how a holistic perspective works and how science tries and how sometimes the scientific methods that are employed. Now, I notice I didn't say science, but I said the particular scientific methods that are employed to test herbs can be inappropriate. We'll talk a little bit about that today also. The brain food chapters were useful so that you could get a sense of how huge nutrition is in terms of overall health. Plants as food are very powerful. We forget how powerful they are. And then there are so many people that they say, well, I feel terrible. I feel weak. I'm overstimulated. I have a hard time calming down. I'm so anxious. All of these things are things that food can affect. If you're not eating very well, then your body is suffering. You don't have enough nutrients. We'll talk more about that next week when we talk about nutrients. But the thing I wanted you to see here with the brain food chapters is that, first of all, nutrition is critical. And secondly, her perspective of scientific knowledge is much more than just one study. Now, this was mentioned more in the introduction or preface to the book than in chapter 1, and so you may have missed it. But she does talk about how you can't just look at one study to make some sort of conclusion. You have to look at the weight of the evidence. And so multiple studies supporting your ideas instead of just picking one study. Lots of people pick one study and call it science. And that's not the case. So figuring out what science is and how to do it is a challenge. You're just getting a flavor of that challenge. But this is a challenge that people who are experts still have trouble with. And certainly people with a lot of training in what you might consider the sciences can still be blind to what the data are and what the data mean. So the scientists, you, me, any other person who considers themselves any part of being a scientist or someone who subscribes to the scientific method. In other words, the idea that you can find out more about the world by using the scientific method. Sometimes people will say, well, science is, as if it's all one thing, or as if science is the same thing as truth. And so what I want you to see is the scientific method, when used perfectly, will create for you a good sense of what is true. The unfortunate thing is that the scientific method is mostly not used perfectly. And so when people say, well, I don't believe in science, I think what they mean is they're unhappy with either what has been found, or they think that methods are not appropriate or any other number of things. Whatever the case is, a scientist must have an open mind, and it's hard to have an open mind. You need to have an open mind. Dogma, in other words, kind of like this truths that we assume are true. We don't really think about how true they are or whether or not they're true. They're just obvious. Dogma and bias, they get in the way. So be aware of your assumptions, because your assumptions will guide what you see. They guide your eyes. So my assumptions, just to be straight open about them, in terms of plants, herbalism, healing, all those sorts of things, my assumptions guide my interpretation of the science of herbalism. And those assumptions are, first, God created the earth, God created plants, God created us, and all of those things purposely. Therefore, plants are not just an evolutionary accident or evolutionary filler that have no sense and connection to the rest of the world. So if every herb is made for the benefit of man, then every plant has some purpose. Even mosquitoes have a purpose. I'm not saying mosquitoes are plants, okay? Just saying. All right, genetic modification does happen. This happens as a result of environmental influences. Sometimes it's adaptive. Sometimes it's just damage. Like, if you're going to eat terribly, then there's an epigenetic effect of this. In other words, your terrible eating will affect your genes, like literally change your DNA, and not in an adaptive way either. So science is about learning how to have an open mind and ask more questions and be skeptical and question your questions and question your biases constantly. The trouble with being closed-minded and trying to be a scientist is that you assume that you're right. That's really a lot of what it is. You assume you're right. And some scientists assume that complementary and alternative medicine and actually everything, not just CAM, they assume CAM can be investigated using conventional biomedical methods alone. And therefore also assume that they're right, that anything holistic should be eliminated, ignored, all that herbalism silliness. So you see this bias a lot. It's really a thing. I certainly have run into it when I've been around otherwise intelligent and competent scientists. Another thing that can be a problem when you're closed-minded is you kind of assume that the way pharmacology works is also the way plants work. Therefore, you test an herb for one thing, because with pills, it's pretty much one thing. I buy ibuprofen and I expect it to work as an anti-inflammatory or, help with pain. So that's the one thing it does. I don't really think of ibuprofen as something that's going to, fix a bone or lower my blood pressure or help with adrenals or anything like that. So one example that you may have seen in that 30 years to be an herbalist article is that example of feverfew. If you don't remember that example, go back and read it. Kind of an interesting example about how you get one use in mind and then you're stuck there. This happens to herbalists too. when your training is training that's kind of in keeping with a lot of Western style medicine, you start to see herbs as one use things. I use this herb to lower fevers, and that's all it does. Or I use this herb to stop inflammation, and that's really the only thing that you think of it doing. It's hard to imagine that an herb can do many different things. And in fact, sometimes what people do is they even consider the fact that an herb is said to do more than one thing as evidence that it's a placebo, or evidence that it's therefore snake oil. And this is just really about lack of education on their part. If they think, well, I think this herb does 5 different things, and they say, well, obviously you've bought into it. You just think you think it's real, but it's placebo, and this is snake oil. Then they're just showing their lack of education, because herbs do generally, more than one thing. Some herbs don't do a lot more, but some herbs do a tremendous amount of very different things. So we'll talk about those. But the idea is, let's not limit our understanding of something because of our assumptions, and our assumptions get in the way. Another thing that happens with science is the scientists want to test a compound that's always the same. So if you want to set up a randomized controlled trial, then what you're testing is a substance, and that substance is always the same. That's the ideal. That's how you want to do it. So that's why when we do randomized controlled trials of therapy, that some therapies don't work that way because they're not always the same. They're individualized. They change with the client. They change with the context. And herbs, as we've talked about, and I think you've learned so far, herbs have a lot of variety in them. They're not all grown in the exact same conditions, and they're not all harvested in the same exact ways. And even if you have an herb over on the left side of the field and an herb over on the right side of the field, and they're the same herb, they are still going to have some variance in their environment that they grew up in. So herbs are not always the same. There is variance. In fact, when you're working with actual herbs and you're trying to put together a product, what happens is that every single time you get a new shipment of herbs in, you sort of have to feel your way around the same product. I'm not saying you reformulate it, but particularly if you're going for taste, you may have to do a tiny bit of modification because there's natural variance all the time in taste and in smell. Not all cinnamon plants smell exactly alike. Not all cinnamon tastes exactly alike. You can get it pretty close, but you can't count on herbs to be the same as you can count on a pill in a bottle to be the same exact pill as the next pill. In fact, here's another little example. This is why if you're getting a really good quality essential oil, that essential oil should not smell exactly the same for years. If it does smell exactly the same for years, I would be suspicious about what else they have done to it, because that's not how essential oils work. That's not how herbs work. There's always a little variation in taste and smell from harvest to harvest, from shipment to shipment. A lot of times people say this, well, if it worked, they would do it. If this really worked, then you would see it in the stores everywhere. And I have some sympathy for that approach. You want to put your trust in the overall generosity of humans, and you don't want to be super suspicious and skeptical. But I think you could also understand that this assumes that there's no monetary motive, or that people have a ton of money to just pour in to things that will never make a profit, like just gift their money away. And sometimes that is not possible. And then the idea that you could do that with herbs, well, there are so many herbs. Which ones are you going to choose to dump some spare money into? And I'm not talking like $10. I'm talking like a lot of money. So there's very, very little economic incentive for anyone to develop herbal medicine, even when it's like mass herbal medicine, like we're just going to make this formula and everybody can take it. It's still expensive to do that when you're looking at plants that you cannot patent, which of course we want to keep it that way. We want people to not patent plants because we want to have them available to us. And so thinking, well, if it works, they would do it. That's not necessarily true. There are plenty of things that work that aren't available easily to you in the drugstore. And if you wanted any evidence of that, just start reading any sort of thing, any literature, any of the scientific literature, and you'll see lots and lots of things work. We don't know they work because nobody's doing publicity, but it doesn't mean they don't work. They work great. When you're examining an extract, so you have a plant and then you extract different parts of that plant. And so you're looking at an extract, a component of a plant. You are then looking at the pure chemical form. You're making it into a chemical. And what you're saying is, okay, maybe this is the chemical that makes the plant work. So you can see again how this is very reductionistic, thinking that the one chemical is what makes the plant work. The plants contain so many different compounds. We have not identified many of those compounds. And for us to make this assumption that we know how plants work it seems just crazy. So we'll say, well, that's the active ingredient, and the rest of them are not active. And so what are they doing? Just making, hanging out, taking up space? I don't think so. I don't think that that's how God arranged plants or constructed plants, to have one active and then the rest of the compounds just hanging out, taking up space. I think we just don't know what they do yet. This science is vast. There's not much that we have been able to accomplish yet. And so I'm making an assumption that there are no inert ingredients. There's nothing that's just space and filler. But there are lots of things we don't understand yet. Here's an example. Artemisia. This is a plant that is used in the drug. In the drug, there is a particular amount of bioavailability. Bioavailability meaning how well can your body absorb the benefits of this drug or this plant. And what they find is that if you're looking at the chemical from the plant leaves, then that chemical is actually 45 times higher than the same chemical when it is in the drug. And so if the same chemical, one's in a drug, one's in a leaf, if it's 45 times more bioavailable in the leaf, then you have to consider that the other ingredients of the leaf are not inert. They don't do nothing. They must do plenty. And there are ways that herbs or foods or, fruits and vegetables, they are food packages. They're not just, a way of delivering lycopene, for example. One quote in some readings was, much of the research to date has been plagued by studies conducted using unauthenticated and uncharacterized product. Okay, so what this means is that in many studies, people will test herb, but we don't know for sure if that is the herb. So the herb hasn't been authenticated, or we don't know what exact species it was. We don't know anything about how it was prepared. We don't know the potency. And so you have research done apparently on some herb, but we don't know if that's for sure what the research was on. And so if you can't guarantee that this is the product that we're researching and it was potent and it was raised correctly, et cetera, that calls into question the conclusions of your research. On the other hand, sometimes what people do is they say, well, we used pharmaceutical grade herbs. And so what does that mean? So pharmaceutical grade doesn't mean the same thing as effective for herbalism. It means that it's safe, that it's pure, and that it has uniform potency. In other words, the potency for the whole product is the same. Does that mean that it is the same as what you would use as an herbalist? In other words, let's say you use some ginseng and it's safe, pure, and has uniform potency. Compared to wild ginseng, we know that cultivated ginseng doesn't have the same amount of effectiveness or potency in some ways. And so pharmaceutical grade doesn't necessarily mean that the best thing that you could do. It just means that it's safe, pure, and of uniform potency. It's unclear if it always can represent traditional medicines. Maybe sometimes it does, maybe sometimes it doesn't. But you can't just pretend that when it says pharmaceutical grade that means it's okay. So we can identify plant constituents. We can identify the chemical action of these constituents. We're getting good at that. We haven't identified all the constituents in plants for sure, just a very small fraction. We can identify how they work in animals, mice, fruit flies, lots of things. But then again, this has some limited external validity. Can we identify reliable clinical action in people? Well, this here is the challenge. People are so individual. Things interact with each other. People's diets, their sleeping habits, their exercise, their environments, how they breathe, how they think, what kind of soap they use in the shower. Like all of these things can affect an individual. And so trying to keep all of those things constant and then identify reliable clinical action it's very difficult. It takes out the individuality, and this can be useful sometimes for science to make some progress, but I think it's troubling to think that if we put all of our eggs in that one basket, I don't think that that's going to give us the results that we really need. Another aspect of plants that we don't consider often is their taste, and the idea that taste has in itself a medicinal action. We think of taste as something that maybe at best will warn us that something's good or something's bad, and otherwise it's like pleasure. But taste itself can create a medicinal action. So for example, cayenne, the taste of the cayenne is part of the overall effect of cayenne. And so we know that if you have cayenne in your mouth, it will have a different kind of medicinal action than just taking a capsule and having the cayenne not in your mouth, not ever experiencing the taste, but having it only operating in your gut. Bitter herbs are another example. The bitter taste creates an effect throughout your body. And that effect is necessary for the herb to act more fully than just simply swallowing a bitter herb. So taste is part of it. Taste is different, again, for all of us. And we keep running into the same problem. You're probably going to get bored of me saying this, but the individuality is so critical in terms of understanding how do herbs work. And randomized controlled trials are not great at individual differences. So here are a couple examples from two traditional Chinese medicine studies, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. So here's one clinical trial treating IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. So they're using pills, encapsulated herbal powders, so that one of them was a placebo, the other one was the pill. And so that way you could compare the placebo to the pill. Great, that's great for a clinical trial. However, the original traditional medicine was boiled up herbs. And so what they're saying is, if you're boiling up these herbs, this is a little bit of a different process than concentrated powders that you put in a capsule. Yes, it's the same plant, but as you remember, the same plant can act a little differently, depending on how it is processed. And so people would argue that maybe the capsule really doesn't reflect what is in the herb when it's used as it's traditionally used in traditional Chinese medicine in its boiled up fashion. Chinese herbal medicine, that's what the CHM means, by the way. Next study looked at teas. This is a trial of eczema, looking at an active and a placebo. And so you wanted a tea that had in it those herbs, and you're comparing one tea to another tea. Well, they had to make the placebo tea also have a strong taste. Otherwise, people would know it was a placebo. And so the whole point of it being a placebo would sort of be lost when people figure out there's nothing in this. It doesn't taste like anything. This must be the placebo. So they had to make the placebo tasting, strong tasting. And so they used, plants, of course, because that's what tea is, to make it taste like plants. However, even though you got the taste and the tea-like thing, you're now introducing a different effect from a different plant. So that's going to get in the way of the placebo. So basically what you're learning is that while the scientific method is great, it's not applied very well when it comes to herbalism. And part of that's because we don't know very much. Part of that is because the people doing the science may not know very much, may not consider very many things. So lots of times these people are not experts in herbalism. When you make assumptions about how things work, this affects the narrative that you tell. It affects how open you are to information. It affects how you see things, and it would affect the science that you accept or the science that you will do. And so here's a little story. I used to work with a woman, I think maybe I mentioned her, maybe I didn't. She was an anesthesiologist at Yale, fantastic woman, just really talented. She was also trained in traditional Chinese medicine, and she did acupuncture. And not only acupuncture, she did what's called auricular acupuncture. So the visual here is a visual of an ear. Auricular acupuncture was something that you use on the ear. So I remember when I first met her, this was a long time before I really embraced herbs. I was straight up 100% stuck in conventional medicine, and in this kind of proud idea that, we're all scientists, we know what we're doing here. Anyway, I knew she did acupuncture. And so I told her that I had a lot of gestational back pain. I was pregnant with my daughter, and it was hurting. My back hurt. She said, well, let me, do some acupuncture. I'm thinking, yeah, right. Acupuncture is just silly. I really thought there was nothing to it. I didn't know anything. I just had no knowledge about what I was saying. But I'm thinking to myself, that's just a bunch of silliness. Acupuncture, whatever. But I'm also very, very open-minded, and I always have been, and I'm willing to try anything. And so even though in my head I'm thinking, yeah, right, I said, sure, I'll, whatever. He put the needle in. And so she started doing acupuncture on my ear. And then I'm thinking, well, gosh, maybe regular acupuncture might have had a chance, but really you're going to put a needle in my ear and that's going to get rid of my back pain? You must be kidding me. And so I was shocked, just absolutely shocked. When she put some needles in my ear, my back pain went away. It went away right away. And not only that, it went away for the rest of the pregnancy. That was, I thought, amazing. And so because of my experiences, I started to have more of an open mind about believing that there's something to this acupuncture thing. Well, then she offered another option for me, called moxibustion. Moxibustion is where you burn something like sage or something next to the body area that you want to fix. And at the time, I just kind of thought that was the goofiest thing I'd ever heard of. And I said, no. That's fine. I don't need to do that. Now I look back and I think, I wonder what would have happened if I had allowed that and been a little more open-minded at the time. So how much we are a product of this culture makes a difference in terms of how we accept, how we see the world, how we can understand what might work, what might not work. And so if you think to yourself, that's not how things work, a needle in my ear is just silly, when it turns out that it really did make an impact, not just on me, but on a number of people that I knew and I dragged in to see this woman, and she so kindly fixed them up with auricular acupuncture. So that changed for me a number of things. If you look at herbalism in the past, a lot of times people will just, completely be disdainful and write off all of whatever happened as, that's just ancient tradition, as if people were stupid back then. We're smart now, and tradition is just silliness, and there's no value to it. But think about it a different way. Here we have people for thousands of years observing, doing systematic observations, recording their repeated observations, developing theories based on many, many, many observations and experiences. Theory that's based in tradition is therefore also a form of empiricism. It's not the same thing as a randomized controlled trial, but it's also not something that you should throw out. It's another way of being scientific. And so don't see traditional herbalism as completely without any science. The whole reason why it's traditional herbalism is because people used the scientific method the best they could in terms of their systematic observing, testing, theorizing, trying out, writing down. There's more science to it than we tend to think. Here's an example. This is another science example of looking at how things have been used and then trying to use science the scientific method in a way that doesn't work. So sassafras. Sassafras trees, marvelous. They smell so good. You pinch off a leaf and smell it, or you pinch off a twig, and this is how they originally made root beer. The original root beer flavor was sassafras. And so if you smell the herb, you can smell kind of a root beery smell. It's really lovely. Plenty of sassafras around here in Virginia. Anyway, the dried powdered leaves are used in Creole cooking, New Orleans, to thicken and flavor their soups. They use the dried root bark steeped to a popular drink called saloup. In 1960, the FDA, however, conducted tests on saffrole, which is a chemical constituent of sassafras. They gave massive amounts to rats. This caused liver cancer because they give massive amounts, right? So they banned sassafras tea. However, inconsistently, they didn't ban a lot of other things that also contain saffrole, like nutmeg, pepper, star anise, or China tea. All of these things had saffrole in them. They were not banned by the FDA. The sassafras tea was banned. Also, saffrole is practically insoluble in water. And so you can't really even have it be something that your body breaks down and takes in. Probably accounting for why sassafras has a long history, very safe use. And so this is a great example of how science is overreaching by thinking that it knows enough. So just like you saw in the David Hoffman video with fennel seeds, here we've got another example of how people misunderstand what's really happening, and they think that if you give a massive amount of something to a rat and it gives them cancer, then it's not safe for humans. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. And this is the same profession that used to give us mercury. So you gotta wonder sometimes if people would be more willing to step outside the box and see things more clearly and be open-minded as scientists. So to conclude, in some ways, the gold standard of a randomized controlled trial is not appropriate for examining herbal medicine. And in some ways it is appropriate for examining some parts of herbal medicine. This is to say that you can't just say, okay, well, let's see what herbs really actually work. Let me consult the scientific literature, and whatever this literature says is true. That is a very unnuanced, reductionistic point of view that is not scientific. It's not scientific. It's closed-minded. And let me say one more time, it is not scientific. You're looking at evidence in a very non-scientific way. So you can't ignore the things that you cannot examine with a randomized controlled trial. If it's appropriate to use a randomized controlled trial, great. But if it's not appropriate, then you can't say just because you haven't been able to test it that it doesn't exist. All right, so that is the conclusion for this week. I tried not to go too far into sciencey stuff because I didn't want to overwhelm you, so I hope that's okay. If you want more, email me, we'll chat, okay? Next week, we're going to talk about nutrition. This is going to be super fun. We'll talk about some nutrients, vitamin D, vitamin C, etc. And then the last 3 weeks, we will talk about herbs, and that will be also so fun for you. So next week, nutrition, and remember, next week is the start of the mini reports that you'll do, and so I'll put those into the modules for you, so you'll see them there, and you can choose which ones you want to do. You need to do 12 of them. All right, talk to you next week.